Hello, good afternoon. Yes, my name is Philip Inman. My job title is that I'm the editor, the economics editor of the Observer newspaper, which is the sister paper to The Guardian, and appears on a Sunday. But I do also write for The Guardian because, as you know, news is 24 hours. So I'm there all week. There is no let up. And I can tell you, as we'll probably hear from some of the panellists, since the Brexit vote, there has definitely been no let up. Everyone wants to talk about economics, and here we are at Talking Economics, so that's so appropriate. I'm not going to do any big introductions. I need to tell you who we have on the podium here. We have Meredith Crowley, Professor of International Economics at Cambridge University. On my far left, we have Henry Overman, Professor of Economic Geography at the LSE. And then in the middle, Helen Turner, who runs the Midlands Innovation from her base at Nottingham. No, not in Nottingham.
No, I run a data agency called Data Cubed, which is based in Bristol.
It's based in Bristol?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, right. I'm very, very sorry, Helen.
It's not a problem.
My apologies, because obviously that experience is exactly what we want to tap into in this debate. So, we're here to discuss the future. And one of the things I do in my day-to-day job is talk to all the top policymakers in the Treasury and the Bank of England, people like Hugh Pill, who was just here on the session before, to ask them what they think the future is. And I can tell you that none of them know. They really are all at sea. The pandemic is something completely new. They know about financial crises, they know about recessions, but they've never come across a pandemic and what it means for the future. But we're going to give you some clues. So I'm going to ask each panel member to tell you the one sort of takeaway that they've got so far in the stuff that they're looking at, and then we're going to use that as a kicking off point for a discussion, and then after a little while we'll bring all of you in with your questions. So I want to start with you, Meredith, if you could kick us off.
Okay, so top observation, I think so I specialize in international trade, and I think for the UK economy, the long run consequences of Brexit are going to be more negative and profound than the COVID recession. So if I look back to 2011, 10 years ago, we were coming out of the global financial crisis, the Great Recession, and trade had completely imploded around the world back in 2009. And then it bounced back really quickly, really sharply, and the world went back to normal. And I think the big difference from my perspective is in 2011, we were in a different policy environment in which the G20 economies had committed to maintaining an open liberal trading system. Throughout the recession, they did, and trade bounced back. Compared to starting in 2016, the economic system that governs world trade has really taken one hit after another. So the U.S., for all intents and purposes, has disengaged with the WTO. They started a trade war with China. And then we saw Britain looking at a different international institution, the European Union, and saying we're dissatisfied with our relationship and pulling out of that. So a lot of the architecture we had for world trade back in 2011 has really been profoundly, I think, bumped and dented. And we don't quite yet know how the new post-COVID trade architecture is going to evolve.
Okay. Big stuff. So if we go a bit more micro, Helen, we look down to earth.
Absolutely. So I guess there's two perspectives I can share. I run a small business, a startup that I founded 5 years ago. So there's the startup community, and then our customers for our data consultancy are SMEs, so small businesses of all different sectors. So I'll give you those kind of two perspectives from the ground, really. So from a startup perspective, founding, setting up, running your own business, your own small business is brutal at the best of times. I worked in the corporate world for 20 years and I thought that was stressful, and then I set up my own business. It's frigging hard. For any of you who are considering it, I might try and put you off a little bit. You have to be a little bit broken to run your own business. It's really, really hard. And then you've got this perfect storm of the pandemic, which not just hitting sales and making your sales pipeline slow down and get smaller and those types of things, but you've also then got the remote working. So your sales process changes, the way that you work with your team changes, everything that you're doing working with your customers changes. So brutally hard running your own business anyway, and then you've got that on top. And that's what I've seen with lots of startups that I work with, and tech startups. A fair few of them have gone out of business. That's the reality of it. Or they've paused, or they've shut down, or they've got another job in the meantime until the market picks up again. So it's been really, really hard for lots of businesses out there. We've been relatively lucky because we are very diversified with our customers. We've got customers that sit in the financial sector, the energy sector, the food manufacturing, and everyone's still eating a lot. So there are lots of kind of businesses that are doing really, really well. We've then lost clients that were in the impacted sectors, so sports, travel, hospitality, those kind of sectors. They're the ones that have been the losers. So that's our perspective. And then from the SME perspective, our customers, just building on that really. So like in any business crisis, there are always winners and losers. So I think we read a lot in the press about how hard it is for business, and it is, and all those impacted sectors massively impacted. But equally, there are a lot of winning businesses out there. So, food manufacturing, our clients have massively grown there. Energy, huge growth. Financial services. So there is this positive side to the crisis too.
And Henry?
Well, I'll start off with two rather glib observations about the crisis, one of which is I am so happy to be back in person. So thank you to the organisers for deciding to go in person. And the second is I no longer need a belt for this suit. The more serious points. So where am I with it? So I won't address the short term here for a moment. I think we can come back to that and the impact of the COVID crisis. If I'm looking sort of longer term over the timescale that Meredith was mentioning, I am actually in agreement. I think that the consequences of Brexit are profound and negative. The consequences of COVID could be profound, but I think in the longer run could actually be positive rather than negative. I think the crucial uncertainty is what happens with working from home. So when I'm looking longer, the big uncertainty in my mind is what model we end up settling on in terms of home working. And I think that's something that we can unpack. I'd be interested to hear the others' views on where they think that's going. And I guess this is, Helen's at the hard end of this, right? Figuring out how to do this. And lots of businesses are figuring out how to do this. But I do actually think that if we can get to a world where we've got more flexible working, we open up the choices for people about working from home, that will lead to gains, not losses. So I think that, longer run, it is, there's scope for it to improve people's well-being and the economic performance of the economy. Of course, the difficulty is the path of getting there. And there, I think that we've got lots of changes to come if we really move to a flexible model. And big changes imply big winners and losers. And so I think that's the second uncertainty that I have, which is once we figure out what the working from home model, flexible working model looks like, what that then implies for where people will live and work. I mean, fundamentally what it does is loosen the link between where you reside and where you work. And that has always led to big societal changes. So I think we're going to see those play out. But what exactly they are, I have some, don't worry, I'm not just going to say I don't know throughout the whole thing, but we can dig into it in a bit more detail. But I think there are then uncertainties about how that play out. So for me, it's really two big uncertainties, like what does working from home look like, and then what are the implications about that new model?
So, Helen, can I ask you, the businesses that you talk to on a day-to-day basis, what direction are they going in when they're looking at this? They're obviously quite digital-minded, and lots of possibilities are open to them. Any themes that you've detected?
I think everybody's still working it out. I think both us and lots of our clients are talking about we've opened our offices, we're saying to everybody, it's up to you, hybrid working. But now we've got empty offices most of the time, and particularly on Monday and Fridays. So I think people are now going, oh, what do we do now then? So this lovely approach to flexible working means that you've got empty office space for 4 or 5 days of the week that might previously have been full. I thought and you also then get into culture kind of things with your teams around, do you force them to come in? Do you say, I want you in on these days? Well, so lots of people don't like that, particularly in the tech world. Tech roles are very competitive, and we've interviewed people who have said, well, if it's not home working, I'm not interested, right? So you then think about your talent pool. So but then you think, well, if we're going to let everyone work from home and have a mobile first approach to work, well, we could recruit from anywhere. So we could get offshoring and nearshoring resource instead of very expensive UK resources. So it's those discussions that are going on with lots of our clients and with the other startups we're working with. And I don't think the dust has settled yet. I think we're still in this. We've gone for hybrid. We think it's a good approach. But now we've got this empty office space and cost implication, and we don't quite know what to do with that. And working policies that haven't evolved yet. So very much still in motion from the businesses I talk to and work with.
Yeah, so when before I came here, I was interviewing the finance chief of Bristol City Council, and so he was talking about how Lloyds Bank have just moved out of a building which is 3,000 people and just left it empty, but they still have a queue of developers wanting to build new office space. But this is the kind of modular office space that they think that they can just literally change at a moment's notice, because they have an uncertain future ahead of them. So they don't want the old buildings. They want new ones still. And they've got a climate change agenda which says, actually, we don't want to build new buildings if we can help it. We want to refurbish old ones. So all those sorts of tensions are coming through. Do you see any straws in the wind, though, from any of your clients to say, have they made no decisions whatsoever? There's nobody saying, actually, we think this is the way we're going to go.
The businesses I speak to have not made that.
Right.
We're going to go 100% home working, or we're going to force people into a certain space. At the moment, they're in this. There's no real option, right? So if you give people the option of when they want to work, they'll work between Tuesday and Thursday. They won't come in on a Monday or Friday most of the time. So you, as I say, you end up then with your office space. It might be busy on those days, but empty on the other. The majority of the time, it's empty. So certainly, the businesses I've spoken to are still wrestling with it. I haven't. But
they're not directing it at all. They're leaving it up to the employees.
Yeah, most of them are. Yeah, most of them are because I think it's really tough right now. I think people are very concerned with mental health. They're very concerned with having a competitive advantage with attracting and retaining talent. And therefore not wanting to alienate people and be a bad employer, right? Let's face it, COVID outbreaks seem to be getting more so in the Bristol area. Certainly, I've known more and more people in the last couple of weeks who have come down with it. So you've got the health angle, you've got the mental health angle.
Yeah,
I haven't seen anyone go, we're gonna completely move to home working, or we are going to force people in. I haven't seen that in the businesses I've spoken to yet.
So larger businesses, I know, definitely. I mean, if I worked on the Daily Telegraph, I'd have been working 5 days in the office since the summer, no question. In my job, I have to go in 3 days a week, and it's staggered, so everyone's in sometime. I don't get to choose Monday or Friday.
I think maybe because I'm working with smaller businesses,
I think
SMEs,
that might be,
maybe the corporates have gone a bit harder on it.
So, Henry, if you take some of that anecdotal stuff and you're looking at it kind of down from a satellite and you're looking at the changing city, what are the things you've seen that you would draw out of that?
Well, let's do the working from home side of it first. I mean, I'll make 2 points. The first is that the survey evidence that we have says, obviously, I mean, it's very obvious that we have more home working than we had before, right? So that's not very interesting. What I think is interesting, though, and picks up on something you were saying there, Philip, was that if you ask workers, so there's surveys out there that say to workers, how many days a week would you like to be in the office and what days? most of them say the most popular answer is 0 or 1. Right, and that's actually, that number is going up slightly, right? We still want to be paid, of course, right? Yeah. But zero or 1. Now, if you ask most firms, the modal answer for firms is 4 or 5.
Yeah.
Right, so there is a very big gap between what firms want and what workers want. Now, the one thing that I think is really interesting is that is a question that has been asked repeatedly over time. And that those numbers are converging somewhat, right? So, there is the firms are starting to think, oh, well, actually, there is some advantages in terms of the talent pool and costs, etc. We can get rid of the floor space, economize down, and the workers are actually thinking, oh, well, 0, actually, I'm fed up with Zoom, and I want to go and see people and go out after work, etc. So I think those two numbers are coming together. So it looks like where we might end up is somewhere in the middle. So that was the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is that the advice that I've been giving to policymakers and anyone who'll listen is the option value of waiting seems very high at the moment. Right? The difficulty, and this actually also relates to something Helen said, is that with firms who are struggling with their cash flow, one of the most obvious things they can do is just get rid of the commercial property. So, there is a real challenge there, I think, between what firms might want to do from a cash flow perspective, where, getting the rent off the books is going to be very good from a cash flow point of view, and the fact that really what they should be doing is keeping the option open. I mean, who knows? Lloyd's, if that wasn't part of a long-run it might have been part of a long-run decision, right, about what their headquarters and regional headquarters look like. That's of course very possible. But if it was an immediate decision, lots of companies that announced early look quite egg on face now, right? Who are saying, oh, we're going 100% remote. Lots of the tech companies did that, and they're now saying, oh yeah, but you notice we said if conditions allow, or if appropriate, and they're all pointing to that caveat coming back. The final point I'll make on that is. If you're on the landlord side, I think the issues that you highlighted around the fact that the investments we've made might not now be the right ones for a more modular, flexible, hot desking type future. You're identifying one of the groups that could massively lose, during the transition period, because the investment is sunk, and the demand is all going to be, they were relying on 20 years of, having people in there, tenants, to pay off the investment they've made, and that money won't necessarily appear.
So when I started in work, you had to work for IBM or Microsoft to be hot desking. You're painting a future where everyone here will not be able to put up a family photo on their desk. They'll just be at any desk, any time, whenever they're...
I would make a distinction. Yes, probably everyone here, but we are the 40% who can work from home.
Yeah.
For the 60% of people who aren't as lucky and privileged as us, things will look very different. So I think, I actually genuinely don't know. I think there's going to be more working. I mean, if there is more working from home, right, if we shift to a thing where some people are in 60% of the time, I mean, Helen highlighted it, there is absolutely no way that you can maintain enough floor space for everyone to have their own desk, because just economically that just cannot make sense. So yes, any of these firms that are shifting towards this, I think the economics of it over time will say, well, then there's got to be more hot desking. We cannot maintain, holding desks which are not occupied 4 days out of 7. That cannot. I just think the bottom line will force those kind of changes.
Now, part of my job as chair is to try and make a link between that and international trade. And but I think that if you're looking at Brexit in the round, and you're looking at the firms that are caught in this Brexit quagmire, that's yet another issue for them to deal with while they're dealing with all this other stuff. Do they reshore because actually that's going to be a better option for them, rather than form filling to get import stuff?
Well, so I think one thing we've learned about trying to reshore and this comes, I think, more from the US-China trade war, is that Trump had this view of like, oh, let's reshore productive activity inside the United States. And there's a certain amount of production activity that can take place inside the United States. But when you reshore, you don't necessarily bring a job with it. You might bring a machine. And so I think in terms of when you think about, so something similar here with Britain, I think Brexit has created this sort of permanent level of sand in the wheels of trade between the UK and the EU. And one of the things is if you look at statistics over the last 6 months, so in January, we began a long-term relationship with the EU called the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. January, trade between the two sides imploded, and it's stayed pretty anemic since then. So different estimates are that UK exports to the EU fell 14% from the start of the year to now, relative to an ordinary year like last year. EU exports to the UK have been worse. They fell 24%, and that's in a sort of context. If you look at German statistics from the start of the year, German exports to the US, China, France, they're all growing about 15 to 20% relative to 1 year ago, the same 6-month period a year ago when we were under COVID, so things were pretty bad. But the bounce back to those places is huge. The growth of German exports to the UK has been 0.4%. So the only place where you're not getting the pickup after the great COVID recession is between the UK and the EU. And I think that's it might be a bit of a temporary phenomenon because these statistics are all impacted heavily by January. We know in the end of last year, a lot of British firms, a lot of EU firms stockpiled inventory. So they weren't thinking, oh, let's start entirely reshoring at that point. But one of the things that I saw recently that I thought was very interesting and troubling is if we look at British exports to the EU just since the start of this year, a study by Johannes Ayele and some co-authors at the UK Trade Policy Observatory found 75% of British exports to the EU entered without paying any tariffs, which means the other 25% had to pay tariffs. And so then the question is, well, what were these guys doing paying tariffs? Because the Trade and Cooperation Agreement says anything imported from Britain that's British doesn't pay a tariff. But the caveat is that's British. And I think this is, how do you determine if something is British? Lots and lots of rules. And what I don't know, and I don't think any researchers know yet, is were British firms paying, and this is a lot, this is £500 million in tariffs they were paying to the EU. Maybe they weren't due, or maybe actually they were paying them correctly because what British firms exporting to the EU were exporting was something that didn't really have enough Britishness in it. So it might have been they imported something from Canada, it was a valuable part, they put it into a machine, and that machine was still too Canadian to count for the tariff exemption rules. So there's a whole complicated set of rules around this, but it could be they just didn't know how to fill out the paperwork, and it might be a year from now we find that fewer British firms are paying these taxes. It could be they knew that there was paperwork and they looked at it and they said, our supply chain is so complex, we don't even understand what we're making in Britain if it's sufficiently British, because we don't know if our parts, if we're using parts from Germany, it would be easier. We could just send it back to the EU, that we wouldn't have to pay a tariff. But if we're using parts from China, we should be paying tariffs. So it's a bit of a complete and total headache. And I think the long-term prospect of how business is going to evolve, I think the damaging thing is so when you look at the sectoral breakdown of who's paying these tariffs, transportation equipment, precision machinery. So these are big industries like autos, and these are high-value industries for the United Kingdom. These are the ones paying the tariffs. That doesn't look so good in terms of the long-term health of a supply chain into the European Union, out of the European Union. And over time, we might see either that the company, could be a multinational, says, you know what, it's not really that valuable for us to be producing in Britain. We might need to just relocate into the EU entirely. They might say, just in the same way, the US and Canada trade, they have borders between them. It's a little bit burdensome, but it still can work. So we don't know yet what the long-term...
Is it possible that the long-term, as it has been of various junctures in the last 40 years, is deindustrialization? So a Brexit dream was that Canadian piece of machinery would actually then start to be made in Britain. But that's for the birds, isn't it? No one's going to start making big pieces of machinery that we haven't made before. They're going to still import it, or they're going to say, let's give up on this business, we'll do something else. And the manufacturing base just shrinks just that little bit more, stays very competitive, very efficient, but smaller.
So two distinctions. So I think manufacturing is going to always become a smaller and smaller share of the economy in the UK because the service sector is just growing, and that's the direction in which things are going. So the entrepreneur on the stage next to us is providing a service, right? And so that's where we have a lot of growth happening. But you have to keep a distinction between, is the manufacturing output shrinking, or is it just its share of the economy? And the output isn't shrinking. The jobs associated with working in heavy industry is what's shrinking. So a lot of, this is the same in the United States, the same in Germany. Output keeps going up, and the value of what we're producing in a sophisticated country like the UK, it continues to go up. But the thing is, we need fewer and fewer human beings to work in those factories because where labor costs are high and people, hurt their shoulders moving big equipment, you think, oh, well, why do we have all these people with rotator cuff injuries? We could just put in a machine. And I think this is, that's the direction. I think the bigger problem for the UK is if you bring the stuff in and you work on it with a machine and then you send it back out to Germany, if you're going to have to pay tariffs every time that happens and the paperwork is a complete headache, if you're a big enough company, you can manage the paperwork. I think the companies on the production of goods side who are going to get killed here and that we were already seeing we're starting to withdraw from the EU, even back in 2016, are the smaller firms. And so the firms for whom additional paperwork and additional sorts of costs of managing supply chain just tip them over the edge into, we don't want to do this relationship anymore with the EU. We're going to either close up, scale down. I think that's the direction we're heading in.
Sorry,
that structural shift, though, that you talked about there, the ongoing one from manufacturing to services, that does interact with COVID and working from home in ways that I just find, really hard to think through. Because, the story that you would tell about the British economy, for the last 20, 30 years is one, on the sort of spatial story, is one where, well, those large structural shifts have actually turned around the fortunes of some of our cities, right? So, actually, if you go back to the 1970s, London was doing appallingly badly. I'm just about old enough to, well, not remember that, but I was born at least. I know that it's like ancient history for most of these guys. But, London was doing terribly badly, and it's, really, really turned itself around. Now, if you go back 1980s, Manchester was doing pretty badly, right? But, 1990s, early 2000s, I mean, the performance of Manchester, Leeds has been in the news a lot, because of the train line, Newcastle, Birmingham, all of those places have somewhat turned around their economies, and they have turned around their economies because of that structural shift from manufacturing to services, right? Or at least particular sort of the kind of services that Helen, et cetera, provide. Because although, it feels like you can do those things anywhere, actually the entrepreneurs and the workers that provide those services tend to want to be in cities, right? So both the firms want to be there and actually quite a lot of the workforce want to be there. Now, where that interacts with COVID is that COVID is in complicated, working from home is in complicated ways changing the cost benefit that workers and firms have to do when they're thinking about, well, do I go to London, do I go to Bristol? So you've got this underlying structural shift, which is still probably pushing us towards the cities, but then suddenly you put the COVID and the working from home shock on that, and that's, does that favour certain cities, all cities? Is it really rural versus the cities? So I think, that's for me where they interact. The other thing where I think they really interact, which Meredith concentrate on the trade side, but we've had 2%, 1.5% of workers over 55 drop out during of participating in the labour market during the COVID crisis. We've got 2% of people who saying they've got long COVID. So these are major labour supply shocks that firms are going to face, and lots of Europeans went home. So, actually on the free mobility side, there is also, I think, a really interesting and complicated interaction between what the COVID shock and the Brexit shock that would have had pretty big implications.
Yes, and I think when you The previous debate we had, which had the Bank of England official on here, and what they're wrestling with is this idea that the pandemic is over, therefore we should go back to the interest rates that we had before the pandemic. And they're getting so many conflicting kind of evidence of whether the pandemic is over or not. And so many, like the companies that you're talking about, Helen, who haven't decided which way they're going to go. And also the evidence from you, Meredith, is whether Britain has taken a step down and is therefore on a lower trajectory as it tries to climb back up again. Do you throw higher interest rates into that? And everyone starts paying higher borrowing costs when they're still worrying about it. Meredith, you're talking about Brexit. Are there any other implications to Brexit that these companies are wrestling with? I mean, it was just touched on by Henry. There was the staffing issue. You know, they're obviously, a lot of them will have relied on staff. They're obviously trying to go green. They're trying to be a greener company. They're probably thinking we're going to get carbon taxes coming down the road at some point in the future. And we are a company that makes lots of carbon emissions. What are we going to do? You know, these are all costs piling up in the future, aren't they?
Yeah, so I'll take up the carbon one just a little bit, in that I think this is a big kind of potential change in the world economy. And so in some sense, there's sort of a question of, you know, if you were, say, a steel manufacturer or some sort of heavy industry that makes a ton of carbon located in Britain or located in the EU, how are you going to cope with carbon taxes? And so I think there's, you know, and one of the big things is the EU has been very forceful in saying they plan to go ahead with carbon border taxes at some point in the future on things like steel. And so this means that if they import an ingot of steel from the US, they'll look at how much carbon that factory that made the steel produced, and they'll say, if you didn't pay a tax on that in the US, we're going to charge you a tax at the border. Okay, so I think in the end, there's a lot of wrangling between the US and the EU about different ways and methodologies. But in the end, both countries are reasonably committed to reducing carbon emissions. Same, you know, with the UK. So that's the sort of objective in a lot of the high-income North. So that will probably come out to something sensible. I think the big change is going to be with respect to middle and lower income countries. So for example, the US has been really upset about the steel overcapacity in China. China is very heavily using coal to make steel. And so that could really fundamentally change the relationship between trade and production in a place that's much more polluting and much more carbon intensive. So I think that's maybe a concern for companies operating in, you know, the Northern Hemisphere in general. But I think their long-term vision is a lot of their consumers are sort of pro-environment, and in the end, they're going to have to go down this route, and there might actually be a bit of a benefit in the sense that they face really intense competition from imports from China. And as soon as you start taxing the environmental cost of carbon at the border, this is going to relax competition a lot. And I think there's a big debate in the trade literature. If the Europeans do this, is it protectionist? Do they really care about the environment, or are they really just trying to put in protectionist barriers against trade? You could debate that till the end of time. I tend to think it's actually they care about the environment, and so that's the way they're going there. So that's one big shift. I think it's a cost to companies, but I mean, I think I think generally companies want clarity about the future. And I think I was on the National Food Strategy Advisory panel, and one of the things that came up there, so that was, what types of food policy should we have for the UK in the future? Should we have high animal welfare standards? How would we implement that as a trade policy? So a bunch of questions around that. And one of the things that, you know, and there were a bunch of questions, the food strategy is very heavily emphasizes health of human beings as a core objective of where Britain should be going. And to that end, there's a lot of stuff about, you know, we really need to think seriously about, you know, maybe taxing sugar, all the bad stuff, fat, alcohol, all the stuff that makes us unhealthy, and try to see what we can do to make better quality foods like fruits and vegetables cheaper. But in this whole range, it was the manufacturers who kept saying, you know what, we know that we have to get rid of the bad stuff in food. And what we need from government is clear guidance about what's the recipe you want us to follow. Like if you told us we could get a healthy emblem on the ready meal at, Tesco or wherever, if we do no more than this much fat, we can do that. Like we have the creative cooks that we can design new products in the food processing sector. But what we need from government is clear guidance so we can all be on the same level playing field. So I thought that was very interesting, is that it's not that companies object to changes in their products that could support human health better. What they wanted was, we don't want to be the only guys who are cutting the fat, sugar, and salt in our food, because then it's going to taste terrible and everybody's going to order the other one that tastes a whole lot better, that's just a little bit less healthy. If we could kind of get some clarity on that. So I think that's a sort of general thing, that carbon taxes, if you can get some clarity for business on what's coming down in the future, they can adapt to that.
And just before I open up to the floor, Helen, do the people you talk to, do they look to government? Are they looking to government for green policies, tax policies that they think should be more, I suppose, more forward-looking, and have some surety about what's going on in the future? Or do they not really care about the government, they're just getting on with their businesses and paying their taxes?
I think probably more the latter. I think there's more of a, I'm worried about my cash flow in the next 6 months, thank you very much, rather than looking further ahead. I think that's the reality of small businesses right now.
And they have lots of job vacancies. We're obviously at record levels of job vacancies at the moment. Yeah,
recruitment is hard, and particularly tech skills. And I think that's because most businesses have been forced to digitally transform. So whereas pre-COVID they could have got away with things. I mean, you think about QR codes, people weren't really using those until COVID hit. So digital transformation has absolutely been forced through loads of firms. So tech skills really hard to find. They always were hard to find, but even more than ever before. So there's a real shortage of tech skills that is growing.
Yeah. So that plays into what Henry was saying about different skills, different types of people wanted in the future. Okay, I'd like to open it up to anyone who has any questions of our panellists. I've got one there, and another one in the front. If you could just say your name and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Jamie Barber from the Bank of England. Question for Henry. Really interested to hear your thoughts on kind of the spatial impact of COVID on the cities. And as usual, kind of, we hear a little bit more about London, and there's things that we're hearing from London there where kind of housing market's booming in the rest of the country, central London flats are not doing that. Kind of central London's taking a bit longer to recover. Shift back to consumer services like theatres is taking a bit longer in London. So one question is, from the data you've seen, have you seen very much of that for the kind of tier down cities, your Bristols, your Exeters, and do you have any views on the future of the kind of second tier cities in that context? And I suppose the other question is, as far as you know and can see so far, would you anticipate some of these shifts to be temporary or longer term?
Yeah. So should I dive in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So my take on the most recent evidence is that the nighttime recovery is the nighttime economy is pretty well recovered everywhere. The weekend economy has mostly recovered everywhere, and that leaves two holes in terms of sort of the demand side, and that is foreign tourists who are spatially concentrated in London and a few other sort of parts of the country, and obviously they're not particularly back, and so that is not great. And then demand from office workers, so the daytime economy. And there, my understanding of the Centre for Cities evidence is that's pretty well back everywhere except London, or you're getting close, right? So I think that there's a question about how much, about how much longer it'll take to see that recovery in London. If you look forward, I'll do a couple of observations on what I think is going to happen on the spatial. So let me do the residential side first. So we're seeing all kinds of silly statements about what's going to happen to residential populations. So to a first approximation, there can be no change in the spatial distribution of the population in Britain because we don't build any houses. So, ultimately, London has got to go back to roughly 8 million people living there because those 8 million people cannot move out to the countryside. So any changes on the resident side are going to be compositional, right? So it's going to be wealthy people being able to move out to now the nice, place with the nice amenities or the nice suburbs. So I think, that they're unreasonably comfortable with the fact that any adjustment that comes on that side is going to be through prices and composition. It can't be through the population. And the idea that, 100 people can, Cumbria's literally got something like 100 vacant homes, right? If you look at the vacant home data. So that gives you a sort of upper bound for what the population shifts can be. The office shift is much more complicated. Now, obviously, what working from home does and having to be in the office less often is it effectively lowers the commuting cost. Now, everyone is assuming that means that firms, will now suddenly think they can spread out. But it's equally possible that actually what we'll see is that firms will think, well, if I've got workers who want to be spread out all over the place, the best place for me to be is in the place which is easiest for the largest number of them to get to. And that's going to be the centre of the city and the central hub. So it's going to be Bristol and it's going to be Birmingham and it's going to be, back into London. Now, who loses out in that world is all this is actually the sort of regional second-tier cities. I would be really worried if I was Crowley or if I was Wolverhampton about what's going to happen, because those places weren't particularly attractive to firms anyhow. And if you're now able to economise on the commercial space, I could easily see, Andy Street, there's a world in which he should be much more worried about Wolverhampton than he is about Birmingham. I mean, and then the final point I'll make on that is that all of the high street and online shopping shock, etc., that then just exacerbates it, because the places whose high streets were already struggling, they are just not coming back as far as I can see. Best will in the world from government policy. And that will be those places that were struggling where there wasn't the consumer demand, etc. If they lose that daytime activity as well, they're in real trouble. So I think the population one, I'm reasonably comfortable on, this compositional effect. I just think the commercial world, the where the jobs are is absolutely up in the air, where they physically are. And I could easily see we've had 50 years, 100 years of falling transaction costs, and that has drove concentration in a relatively small number of places. I wouldn't bet against that trend continuing, with people just now doing longer commutes into London, into Birmingham, into Manchester, but slightly less frequently than they do at the moment.
Thank you. I had a question there. Could you just say who you are?
I'm Kishore Samara. I work in the Department for International Trade. So this is a question mainly to Meredith. So a big pull for the Brexit argument was that the United Kingdom could sign a range of more free trade agreements than the EU could ever do, and particularly to the high growth areas of the world, like, particularly the Indo-Pacific region, Southeast Asia, and Asia in general. So looking into the future, if those agreements do come into fruition, will this make a big difference in terms of the UK's growth prospects? And also, typically a free trade agreement benefits the trade of goods more than services. Could this then also be a revitalization of the UK's, well, you said shrinking manufacturing sector? Or will it always be services dominated forever? Thank you.
So in terms of the trade agreements, the question is going to be what's actually going to be in them. And so I think, starting with the one that I think the government is the most concerned about going forward is the US-UK potential free trade agreement. And I think the Department of International Trade's own analysis is that there's very little that can change in that relationship, and so the gains from that relationship are quite small. So it's just a fact, if you look at U.S. outward foreign direct investment in a region they call Europe, which is very big, it includes Russia and Turkey, so not just continental Europe, but that's that region of the world. Half of the outward FDI stock of the United States is in Britain, of the European stock. So Britain is a huge, important location for U.S. outward investment. So in terms of thinking about liberalizing rules between trade between the US and the UK, we already have and have for decades had an incredibly intense investment relationship. We have an incredibly intense trade relationship. So the UK's single most important export of goods partner is the United States. So it's more important as a single country than Germany. So there's not a lot of extra room to deepen that relationship, in my opinion. There can be things around the edges, but I'm not sure. If you go to the Indo-Pacific, so then the question is, well, what do you want to sell them and what do you want to buy? And I think it's really expensive to send anything from Japan to the UK. Either you put it on a boat and it takes a minimum of 2, but as long as potentially 6 weeks to get from point A to point B, or you put it on a plane that's pretty expensive to move. So while I think it's possible, so the US has very big trading partners on the other side of the Pacific. They're crossing an ocean. The distance between, Western Europe and Asia is longer. So the key fact in international trade is you need to be close to trade goods. And so I'm not so convinced that things like the, agreement with Australia is really going to change things dramatically. You'll increase trade a little bit on the goods side. On services, it's a lot more complicated because it depends on what the rules are and what types of liberalization you want. And I think one of the things, services agreements are much more invasive into a country's domestic law and sovereignty than a goods agreement. So a goods agreement just says, I'm not going to tax you at the border, and if you make something that won't, kill people, I'll buy it. So I'm not going to, import dangerous toys or combustible things or whatever. So all kinds of safety rules, which are pretty basic. But in terms of the services agreement, one of the tensions of the UK-EU relationship was precisely that the UK didn't like the EU constraints on UK policy over services. And so now they're going to say, oh, we want to go have a deep trade agreement over services with other countries. I think in concept, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're all common law countries. They're all, the US, they're all former British colonies, so maybe that's very easy to affect. It gets much more complicated when you're talking about an economy like Japan or Korea, which is very, very closed to services trade. It's very, very hard. Their distribution networks for goods are close. A lot of services are very hard to penetrate. And then I just don't think it's at all realistic for the UK to think about a deeper relationship with China right now because, that thing is becoming a mess with security, but the UK has been quite clear in their policy, and I think something to be admired for, that they stand with the people of Hong Kong in all of this UK-China tension. And so I think that kind of closes that door for a while.
I think I'd be ruder than you. I'll be less diplomatic. Mm-hmm. We're just wasting a ton of time replicating the shallow agreements, and we're going to end up basically with exactly the same shallow agreements as we had, the stuff that governs trade, etc. Or the variations won't really matter for the economy. And then the most obvious place to have a deep relationship with was Europe, and we've said no to that. And then it's not obvious who either that we want a deep relationship with or who wants a deep relationship with us. So, I mean, neither of those. I mean, fundamentally, I've just said a cruder version, I think, of what Meredith just said. The shallow ones is small beans, and we're wasting a lot of energy replicating things that we could have had. And the deep, no one knows really, do we want to be Europe? Do we want to be aligned with the US? Which regulatory regime do we want? Even if we'd made our mind up, lots of the other places don't necessarily want to strike that deep relationship with us. So, we had the deep deal that was available to us. That's the European Union. We chose to get rid of it.
I think one thing that's worth thinking about is that our history is something, I suppose, in this sense we share with the US, which is that when we have this kind of turning point, when we have this crisis and we look to move forward, we tend to leave those people who don't fit with the future behind. We don't tend to look after them very much. We're not very continental European in that way. And whether it's the miners in the 1980s and the Rust Belt in the US, we tend to leave people behind in their old industries that don't really work anymore, and they get lower and lower pay, and their children go to worse schools, and they don't really, and their social mobility comes to a grinding halt. And you would all be in the category of the winners. You would all be the people who are going to college and therefore adaptable, and will be part of the future. And you'll be listening to our panelists thinking, oh, that's the direction of travel. Okay, I can adapt my education to fit with that. Even if you don't want to be a software engineer, there might be something else that you hear. It'd be interesting to hear what you're thinking of when you hear these snippets of the future and think how you might fit in. Does anybody here want to contribute on that? Or just ask a question of the panelists, another question. Because I will if you don't. Yes, at the end. All right.
Hello. Yes, thank you. Enrico, just a basketball student. Do you believe that maybe we were already moving towards a direction of working at home and doing stuff because, we already had these systems like Zoom and Google Meets available to us at the time, but has COVID maybe moved us in that direction prematurely? And was there maybe, plans that companies had, 10, 15 years in the future that to do all this just pushed forward to now? And, was it the best way, and could it be done better, pretty much?
Can I ask Helen to come in on that, and then the others can as well, obviously?
Yeah, I think absolutely. So definitely in the startup community and small business community, working from home, everyone was using Zoom or Google Meet. Everyone was already using tools like Slack to communicate online. When you're a small business, you don't want the heavy costs of offices like Henry talked about. You're already working. You start at the beginning. You're working from people's lounges and coffee shops and that kind of thing anyway. And then you get used to that. That becomes part of your culture. That kind of relaxed way of working. So definitely in small businesses, we're already moving in that direction anyway, which meant when COVID hit, we were able to just switch overnight into, no one's coming into the office, but we had no changes of systems, none of that. And I think that was really common with any service business, and any small business would have had exactly that experience, whereas the big businesses are very different. Now, I worked for 20 years in the corporate world, so I worked for AXA and Computershare, big global organizations. Now, they were entirely different. And culturally, in lots of big businesses, they had the opposite view. They had the view of, can't possibly trust our employees to work from home. They have to be in the office. We have to clock them in, clock them out, and they had a massive shift, didn't they, of suddenly going, goodness, we've got to change everything, which was a big overhaul for them, having to give everyone laptops, having to track people working from home and all of those types of things. So I think definitely it was already going in that direction, but it's fast-tracked. I think an example of that is, so in the small business startup world, flexible office space is a really common thing, and that was really growing in the last kind of 10 years or so. And it's going to be really interesting how that market changes, because that market was growing and growing and growing until COVID. Clearly dropped off a cliff during COVID. No one was going into any offices, so all those flexible office spaces would have got zero money coming in. And now we've been looking in Bristol at those kind of places, and they've got a problem now in that people go, well, I don't want to pay for 5 days a week for a desk when I'm only going to use it 1 or 2 days a week. So I think there's going to be really innovative models coming in about flexible working that are not yet kind of developed. So yeah, I think it's already going that way, but forcing employee policy change and things like that.
The one thing I think I would add to that is, although I think the trends were in that direction, it's a classic economics problem that there was a coordination problem that it's very difficult for any individual firm to solve. So, if you think about being in a world where, you're the only person that decides to remote into a meeting. We were in that world, and that was terrible to be the person that was remoting in. Anyone who'd ever been in any of those meetings. And this is still, by the way, so let me make 2 points. So the first thing is, we got coordination. The big shock meant that suddenly everyone that could was shifting and thinking about it. And I think that the way in which it coordinated a whole bunch of behaviour, there will be a network effect to it, which means that it probably does. That's why I think that there will be some structural shift, and we will see more working from home than if, so I don't necessarily even know it's accelerating, because I think, we could have got stuck, or, you get to a point where there's just not quite the critical mass of people doing it. So I think that the crisis did sort of shift that. I think there's still a huge number of investment decisions that firms need to make that they're holding off on, that will really determine how far we go. So actually, as I'm discovering, being back at work, hybrid meetings, they are still problematic, actually, when the technology is, unless you've gone really to the absolute top end, it's terrible. You can't see the people speaking, half the people's Wi-Fi don't work. So there's something about businesses still got to make major infrastructure and investment decisions. They've still got to make decisions about what the culture will be. Is it you're coming in 5 days a week, or you're coming in when you want, or it's Monday, Wednesday? They've got to make decisions around skills. With the best will in the world, I am 51. I am just about getting to the point where my teenage kids have to help me with technology, so that anyone older, on a Zoom call is struggling with this. So there's a big skills investment. Oh, I don't know how to mute. How do I put my hand up? All of that kind of stuff that you still get. We're 18 months into the crisis. There are loads of people that can't handle that. We also know that the big productivity gains don't come from the technology necessarily. They come from figuring out how to use the technology efficiently to improve the profitability and the productivity of the business. We're still a long way from that. And then actually, finally, there are going to be massive issues around protecting people from this. Most of the people in this room lost at some point because of what it did to your education, right? And you need, there is a real question about, how you're compensated for that, or what your protections are. And that just applies writ large across the economy. There are going to be huge issues around how we protect people's rights, either to remote work, or in terms of their right to disconnect when the working day is done. There are huge gender implications of this for women who already pick up the majority of childcare responsibilities, and we're now fudging where work takes place, so they can't be saying to no, I'm in the office, you've actually got to deal with the children. All of that's going to get grey. So I think, I think it's the coordination thing I think has been important, but I still think there are huge unanswered questions that will really determine how far we go and how much we make sure that the benefits of this are spread widely rather than concentrated on a small number of people.
Yeah, let's hope there's no Wi-Fi outage, otherwise it all drops off a cliff, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it's strange how in quite a short time we forget. I mean, when I started work, no one knew where I was all day long. Only if I phoned in did they know where I was. And then I would turn up at work maybe about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I would say what stories I'd got, and the presses were rolling at about 10, 11 o'clock at night, and you'd be there through in the evening. But literally through the day, there was you would phone in your story, but they didn't know how you were working, what you were working, how you got what you're doing. Now it's completely the opposite, and it's as if they couldn't possibly go back to that world and trust me that I'm going to turn up with the goods at the end of the day. And they're really struggling with it, aren't they? I mean, they do really struggle with this idea, even though their predecessors had to do exactly that in a pre-digital age.
Well, I'm not terribly optimistic about it. I mean, I do think that in a world where you're working from home but always on, there's actually scope for almost going back to a terrible clock in, clock out, always knowing where you are. I mean, we're starting to see, anecdotally, we are starting to see that one of the ways, so it used to be that you'd come to the office and no one was really monitoring if you went outside for a cigarette or a coffee or whatever. And then some workplaces got really quite unpleasant on that, really started restricting it down. I don't necessarily think the technology is all benevolent here, right? I think we could see quite a lot of being able to monitor very precisely what people are doing. People are expected to be, always on, always contactable within really quite broad time periods once you sort of lose that boundary between home and work.
I think you've got the opposite side as well, though, the mental health issues. So managing people remotely, they need to communicate their issues verbally to you. Whereas if you were sat next to them in an office, you might pick up on the fact that they're struggling with different things. So things like that can be more hidden, not dealt with so earlier. You have to work so much harder at communicating. So there are those types of implications too that are really important for, teams and managers and culture.
Yeah. Another question. One at the back. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you. So good afternoon. I'm Anastasia from the University of Warwick. So picking up on how you mentioned how we used to clock in and clock out, but now it's more of a toxic environment, if you want to call it so, where you're supposed to you're supposed to be contactable throughout broader times during the day, as you were mentioning. So there's more of a workaholic culture, maybe. Do you think this will continue into the future, or do you think that people will eventually pressure firms into giving them more free time? Thank you.
Who wants to go first? Helen, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can talk about it from our perspective. I think it's just your leadership has to be more accountable, right? You have to create a culture that means that you don't go down that path, and you can do that in a number of ways, right? You can do that in terms of rules that say outside of certain hours. You're not meant to do that. I think I saw something in the news today. Is it about Portugal have put in a rule that you can't contact people out of hours? So you could go down that way, or you create a culture where people know what's expected of them and what's not expected of them. But I think in any organisation, I'm a big believer that culture comes from the top. So I'm the founder and manager of my business. So the whole culture of the business is driven by me. So whenever I'm not happy with something, I look in the mirror, right? So I think it's your leadership have to be really accountable for the culture that they drive. And I'm a big believer that if your people are happy, they perform at a much higher level. And something we do at every team meeting, I started this at the start of COVID, was, number one priority. I give everyone there's only 3 things I want you to worry about at any point in time. And the number one is always keeping yourself healthy. And that started during COVID, physically healthy and mentally healthy. So I think it comes down to leadership and culture to make sure that you don't end up with that workaholic culture where you end up with burnout. You end up with illness, you end up with all those issues, you end up with high attrition, because who wants to work in that kind of toxic environment? So I think it comes down to leadership, but also in larger organisations, there's policies as well that might be right.
Maybe you two could just talk briefly about that as academics. You're about to go on strike over working conditions and pensions.
Well, I might be about to reveal my slight political persuasion here.
Fred, I have a related point on culture that I think is sort of kind of ties back to, so there's a sort of question of what's going to happen post-COVID. And when I think back to when I was your age, sitting in the university lecture hall, at that time, one of the political science pieces we were reading was this article called Bowling Alone, and it's by Robert Putnam, Harvard political scientist, one of the most important works in social science. And basically, he talked about in the 1950s and 60s in the US, everywhere in America, people were in bowling leagues. So like a guy finished a work shift, joined a bowling team, and whether you were the lawyer in your town or the machinist, you all played in a recreational fun bowling league. And this was this very nonpartisan, community-based thing, and he talks about this as being an informal institution, like many informal institutions we have in society, for people to express political ideas and dialogue about solving community-based problems. Trash collection, school finance, basic, how to keep the parks clean. And so what we saw in the United States was, as women entered the workforce, other changes came, these institutions declined and basically disappeared. And so now we're in this world where people's, culture was starting to come more from their workplace, but people are in segregated workplaces. Now we see in many parts of the world very polarized discussion. And so I think one of the things that worries me about the rise of online, so we all read about Facebook and polarized camps of people discussing ideas. There's a concern in my mind that as we have more and more online forums and more somewhat isolated ways in which we're interacting, that this is going to further contribute to things like a polarized political debate. And so I think that's one of the things that I worry about, and I worry very much about all of the informal ways in which people communicate and exchange information. So back in the day, nobody was tracking where you were, but nobody doubted that you were doing something useful in terms of finding the story, because there were taxi receipts, or, at the end of the day, there was a piece of work you produced. And so it was a different set of cultural norms, but I think this is a sort of big thing, because when we think about some of the big issues like Brexit, you've made reference to like a weak social safety net in the UK. Some people in the UK over the last 20 years have done fantastically well, and others have done quite poorly. And the Brexit, decision seemed to me a lot of people who weren't fully informed about the consequences of what it would mean for the economy. But I also think there's a side of me which can say, well, for British people participating in the European Union, if you wanted to affect change in a domestic policy, a regulation over safety standards or whatever, you didn't actually know who had control over that particular policy issue. Was it something that was controlled at the level of UK national government? Was it controlled in Brussels? And so Britain's participation in the EU was part of this like murky, multi-level democracy that people didn't fully understand. And then in that world, you get this kind of crazy debate. So I worry a little bit about how society is going to go forward if we're too much working from home. Because I see this potentially as another kind of cultural shift away from sort of the bowling alleys toward work-based engagement, toward I'm not sure what's going to happen if we don't have, second-tier cities where people are going in and chatting in coffee shops during the day. I think that's potentially worrisome.
Yeah. So we've kind of run out of time, so you need to be relatively brief.
Well, I was going to say, cultural norms will do some of it. I mean, it's like so many of these problems. The market will do some of it, and then policy will have to do something. Really, you think about really how we go about sort of regulating these aspects of the economy. It's usually that three-way mix, right? So there'll be cultural and societal norms will do some of it. Some of it, the market will deal with, because people just won't be willing to take it and they'll be able to move to other employers. But we know there's a whole bunch of people that don't quite have that freedom and mobility and choice, and the state will need to step in there and make sure their rights are protected. It's just what that three-way balance should look. The thing I should say that slightly depresses me is that the British government's track record on managing sort of disruptive platforms and these sort of sources of where we need new regulation, we've really struggled in the last decade. You see these arguments over what we should do about hate on Facebook and social media. The state is in a bit of a mess about how it should, about what it does about these new platforms. And, so if we're struggling with these new platforms, Bitcoin, all of these kind of things about where we are, I'm not confident that the state will get to a good position, particularly soon, on these rights. In the meantime, the market and entrepreneurs like Helen have to step in.
Well, on that uplifting note, I'm afraid we have to end the session. If you could thank our panelists in the usual way. And if I could ask students, you want to step in here, Ramesh?
I'll take over, yeah.
Okay, fine.
Okay, three quick things. So that brings to the end the Economics Observatory Talking Economics events over the past 3 days. Just want to say a big thank you to the Economic and Social Research Council that provide our funding. The second thing to say is, although Talking Economics has finished, the Economics Festival and our partners at Bristol Ideas continue with a fantastic series of events for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening. First one, a great panel on the debt hangover. We have Rory Kethlen-Jones talking about his dog Cabbage and what we can learn about social media and the age of the smartphone. We have Linda Yu and George Magnus talking about China-America, some of the issues that Meredith touched on. And finally, we have a great panel with Diane Coyle chairing the co-curator of the Festival of Economics, talking about the division of household labour. Students from Bristol or elsewhere, you are all welcome to stay on for any or all of those sessions. So please do feel free to stay around for those. In the meantime, you are all welcome to join the director and co-curator of the festival, Richard Davis, at the back of the room, far right. He's just waving to us now, where he has presents for you. And anything else I should say, Richard? I think I've got it. And I should finally say thanks to all our panelists at Talking Economics, and particularly to this great last panel, Henry, Helen, Meredith, and Philip Inman of The Observer. Just to correct myself there. So give them another round of applause. Thank you very much, all of you.